Welcome to Global HR Virtual Summit 2022. Myself, Dr. Vanita Agarwal. This summit is hosted by Bizemag Media. Today's guest speaker is George Kemish. George is a versatile, experienced HR strategist from United Kingdom. He is in his 11th year as an employability mentor at the International Business School at the University of Lincoln in the United Kingdom. He is also the founder of Specialist Human Resources Limited, a business consultancy specializing in HR strategy and value management. Welcome, George, to the Global Summit. And we are thankful to you that you accepted our invitation to be a speaker.
Good morning, Vanita, and thank you very much indeed for the invite. I very much appreciate it and looking forward to it.
So George, starting with this summit session where the topic is flexible working, employee and organizational development, I would ask you, what are the pros and cons of flexible working, particularly now that we have already seen in COVID time since last 2 years almost?
The pros obviously are the fact that people are not having to travel between their home and the place of work. So obviously, as far as work-life commitments, it's much easier for them because, you know, they can gain anything up to an hour or 2 hours a day from not having to do it for that travel. So from the employee's point of view, you know, that's handy. Also, you know, if they have children and that sort of thing, it makes it a lot easier if they're working remotely. They can, you know, if they're working from home, because they're not having to pay out for somebody to look after their child during their working hours. From the employer's point of view, it can be a headache if it's not managed very well. I mean, we're talking about a change in structure, organizational structure, and the organizational structure normally would support the strategy, capability, and culture within the organization. But of course, with remote working, you only have the one structure, and that's a network structure. So you would have, if you thought about the structure, and in the center, you would have your senior management team, and then possibly your team leaders working remotely, but then you would have all your team members also working remotely. So what you in fact do is to bring about a structure where everybody is isolated. And it's the communication and collaboration that really causes the problem here. I mean, if we were to look at something that Peter Drucker said, he said knowledge management would have a major impact on the structure of an organization. And we've got to be very careful to make sure that that doesn't turn on its head, whereby the knowledge management or the structure is having an impact on the knowledge management. You know, it's very, very difficult.
That is.
Especially when it comes down to the fact that what you're actually doing is, we were trying to get away from this idea of having departmentalization and silos. And what we've created in effect is individual silos by having people working remotely at different locations. They're not even co-located as a team. So that then brings about quite a problem. And much of that comes down to development of staff. And of course, you develop your staff, and by developing your staff, you develop the organization, and that leads to growth. But if you're not getting that development, then it makes it very, very difficult to get that growth. And the other problem that we have is that if the structure is not supporting the strategy, capability, and culture, you end up with a paradox whereby you're trying to support the structure rather than the structure support the organization. But the strategy, capability, and culture needs to support the value chain working back from the customer. So you can't change the strategy, capability, and culture to suit the structure, because if you do, then you end up distorting the value chain. So it's really a case of how do you manage that? And a lot of the problems we're finding is with staff development and collaboration.
Yeah, you're right, George. And when it comes to remote working and flexible working, something like humanitarian equations or the equations that develop at workplace while on the physical side, they are absent, they are quite absent in the online mode. So how companies or HR should support organizational development in such scenarios?
Well, that's before we go on to that, I'd just like to give an idea of what's actually happening. And because I actually have some figures here which are interesting. And WeWork have undertaken a survey, and they found that 41% of Gen Zs, and these are the people that are used to working with computer and IT, have actually said that they're missing the mentoring. They don't feel that they're getting the mentoring that they should have. So obviously this comes down to the communication between the team leader and the individual. But it also comes down to the fact that when we look at both Gen Z and millennials, they're also saying that they find it difficult to communicate with their own colleagues. So they're not even getting support from their own colleagues. So there is something wrong somewhere in the line of communication. And I think what has happened from what I've seen is that we have a line of communication coming out from the senior management team to the leaders, to the team leaders. And then you have communication going out to the individuals in the team, but there's no line of communication between the team members, and that's something that is lacking.
True. So when you say, I will come to my question later on, the one that I asked, the role of HR. First, because we are going continuously along that line, staff development and organizational development, what is the correlation? And how we can overcome these problems? Right,
well, what we have to look at is there's two different styles of knowledge management. I'm going to have to read a piece because I have to get my head around these names. But basically, knowledge management owes its inspiration to the work of philosopher Michael Polanyi, and Japanese organizational learning guru Ikijuru Nonaka. You can see why I've had to read that. I'd never keep it in my head. But basically what they argue is that there's two forms of knowledge. There's explicit and implicit. So the explicit knowledge would be the sort of knowledge that you would get by undertaking a training course. Everybody knows the knowledge is there and it can be taught. The implicit knowledge is the knowledge that you actually gain in the workplace. It's the unstructured knowledge. People don't know it's there. It's in people's heads. So in effect, it's tacit knowledge. And that really comes down to subjective insight, intuition, judgment, inspiration or innovation. It's things that are happening all the time. And as we know from experience in industry and commerce, that it's changing all the time. And people will pick up information. They could pick it up from, if they're talking to suppliers, they could pick it up if they're talking to customers. They could pick it up normally from talking to colleagues, but as we've already discussed, there is a problem with that, because there is a problem with the communication between team members, which is then creating this problem of, you know, a lot of this knowledge is not being shared. And that is one of the problems that HR are going to have, because knowledge management comes down to HR. How it's managed is, it comes down as part of the culture within the organization, and it's the learning culture within the culture. And if the learning culture is distorted through problems with communication, then you end up with lack of staff development and lack of organizational development. And then you don't manage to meet customer expectations. You start losing out in the marketplace. You know, it's just a snowball that carries on if it's not well managed. So, I mean, there are things that you can do. I mean, one of the things that I've suggested is that perhaps it would be possible to have a development day for employers to actually set aside a day to take people out of work, maybe put into a social setting where they'd be more relaxed, more open, and would discuss what they're finding, you know, in their own work. But one of the problems that you've got with all this is the fact that the employee themselves need to understand their own development and have a plan for their own development. They need to understand where they fit in to the value chain, because they need to know how their work adds value, because otherwise when they see changes happening, they don't realize that those changes are going to have a knock-on effect elsewhere. And this also comes down to team leaders as well, because it's all right having a development day for the team, but then you have to have a team leaders meeting to discuss any changes that have been found, any implicit learning that has come out of that may then cause a change somewhere else in the organization and not just in that particular team. So you have a number of things that need to be looked at to ensure that, you know, it's being, all this implicit knowledge that people collect is being shared, and it's being shared to the right people.
Yeah, that's right. So how, you are consulting, what are the areas that you are consulting the organizations in such struggling times? And what are the challenges that you help organizations to deal with? If you can share light on your own experiences with the companies, which will help our audience to know and to learn from your experience.
We're finding a lot of things that need to be ironed out. I mean, one of the problems that's come about when it comes to both explicit and implicit knowledge is that we're finding that when customers are talking to their suppliers, one of the problems is they're being given incorrect information. So it depends on who you're talking to within the organization as to how relevant the information is that you're being given. That's one problem that we're finding. The other problem that we're finding is that it can take a long time for problems to be resolved. And the reason for that being that depends again on who you speak to as to whether or not they have the knowledge to sort the problem out. And it goes further than that as well, because some of these problems they will pass on to other departments, but then they're not checking to make sure that the problem is rectified. So nobody's going back to the customer, and the customer is just left in limbo to wonder what's happening.
Yeah.
And these are the sort of things that we're finding. And a lot of this comes down to both explicit and implicit knowledge and learning, and things just not being passed from one person to another. So they're losing expertise, basically.
That is true. I will give one example of that. Recently, I have. So I was trying to renew my Zoom subscription from free to paid. So I had a paid subscription, then I did not renew it for about a month, thinking that I'll renew when I will need it. And somehow Indian regulatory Reserve Bank of India, they passed a judgment with effect from 1st January 2022 that one cannot make online transactions on a website like Zoom unless Zoom provides a mechanism that credit card details would be hidden off from the platform. Now, I tried to call their customer care. I tried to chat with the person. On that day, the person whom I was speaking to, she simply gave up, quoting that Reserve Bank of India notification that it cannot be done, you cannot do it until Indian government solves it. So whole day I wasted trying to renew, try to connect with the correct kind of Zoom person in billing and information. And 3 days later, I was told by my husband that he has renewed his own. It's not difficult. Why you are not able to? Maybe you are not talking to the right person. So I said, no, I spent the whole day and this is not a solution coming through. Then he again joined me to the customer call. And this time the person said, you have to delete your current account, recreate the account, and then change the currency. And then you will be able to make the payment. So this time I was talking to the right person who knew what was the problem and what is the solution. And it was sorted out in 10 minutes, max 10 minutes.
Yeah, so very much depends on the capability of the person. And what we try and do when we go into organizations is to look at the capability and make sure that everybody is singing from the same song sheet, because it's so easy for people to miss out on something that has happened that has caused change if that change is not being passed on, and we're finding a lot of this. It's very, very difficult, because what a lot of employers have done when they've put this structure in place, this network structure in place, they've just thrown people out into working from home or working from wherever, and tried to use the same structure that they had before, and it doesn't work because they've actually changed the structure by moving people out to remote working. They've gone onto a networking structure. You cannot change that. That's what it is. And of course, you then have to find ways of, well, okay, fine. How do you then make the structure support the capabilities and the culture required to support the value chain? And that's what they have to do. They've got to look at how they actually have people interacting. They have to look at how their communication works. They have to make sure there's collaboration. They have to make sure that maybe, as I've said, put in a development day, maybe once a fortnight or once a week. Once a fortnight or once a month, so as they can actually look at everything to make sure that they have captured that implicit knowledge that is otherwise lost. Because normally you would be in the workplace with people, you would hear people say things, people might say things to you, you might overhear a telephone conversation, you might see something happening, and it's all implicit knowledge that is then being shared. But if you're not in the workplace, you don't get that. So you have to find a way of capturing that implicit knowledge and communicating it, because it doesn't become explicit knowledge until such time as it is communicated. And that's where a lot of the problems come from with remote working. Remote working will work, but it has to be well managed. And it has to be managed in a different way. It takes different leadership and management skills to actually manage remote working, to managing working in a normal working environment where people are co-located.
So in a nutshell, we can say, since the mode of working and mode of conducting business is changing, we have to change and develop the strategy of HR and other departments as well. It is not going to be that you have just shifted offline model to online model. It is not going to happen, because there are so many things involved in it that they all need to be managed very well in order for the businesses and in order for employees to be successful, to have that feeling of growth. Because employees are not there for work only, they are for self-growth also.
Well, the big problem that a lot of employers have is the fact that they've been doing it for 2 years. What has changed in that 2 years? And a lot of employers don't know what's changed. They haven't thought about, okay, fine. We need a platform on which to build all this implicit knowledge that we're gaining, and it will be gained constantly, because change is constant in business. So you've got to look over the last 2 years and see how you're going to capture everything that's happened that you haven't known about.
Correct.
And the only way that we see to do that is through a quality continuous improvement event. And and really it should be for HR to run that, although it will need the team leaders in there, because obviously they need to show what their systems and processes are. But a lot of it is going to come down to man management as well, or people management, I should say. I'm using man in both the feminine
singular
and masculine. But they've got to do things like mapping out the processes and procedures that are undertaken by the employees. They need to map out the value chain working back from the customer, and to look at customer expectations. They need to map out the interactions that support the value chain, both internal and external. And that's between the teams as well, how they interact. And normally that would entail how teams communicate, they collaborate, highlighting why collaboration is required and looking at outcomes of the collaboration. But remote working is difficult because you're not seeing that. So that's something that will come out of one of these events. You need to look at the leadership and management techniques that are being utilized to manage remote working. Do they meet the need in ensuring that the right strategies, capabilities and culture required to ensure staff engagement is there? You also need to identify skills fade, because people working remotely, if they haven't been utilizing certain skills, then those skills become rusty. You know, they lose a lot of that skill. So you need to look at that as well. Have your people lost any of the skills that they might have used previously that they haven't been using in that remote setting? And are those skills still relevant? Because if they are, then people will need possibly retraining. And you need to identify any new knowledge, skills, or experience that may have been attained whilst people have been remote working, and how that affects not only their own team, but also other teams. If something happens in marketing, it could affect sales.
Correct.
You know, if something happens in operations, it could affect finance. You know, you need to see how all these changes that are being brought about that people haven't really been aware of are having an effect on the organization. It's time consuming. Nobody likes doing it. But if you don't do it, then you don't have this platform on which to build, to look at and capture future learning. And that all comes down to HR.
Mm-hmm. That was great, because definitely the business consists of all the departments, and each department supports the other department. It's intra-network, so one needs to take care of not only inter-people management, but also intra-people management. Thank you, George, for being here. It was great knowing from your great learning experience for me and for my viewers. Thanks a lot for being our guest speaker.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Vanita. It's been really, really great. I've enjoyed it. And it's lovely to see you again.
Sure. George, we are planning a panel discussion also, where we will have 3 or 4 or 5, as many as we can have, not much, not more than 5 panelists in one go, out of our speakers who will be there. This summit is going till March now. So I will ask you on one of such panels if you wish to come, and we will finalize a date somewhere in end of February.
Oh, that sounds very good. I would like that.
Thank you. I'll send you the mails once things are finalized.
Thank you very much indeed. And you stay safe.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.